Hello there, John here. You're about to watch a really interesting conversation that I had with Doug Hunt, who's one of the pioneers in this field and is a professional sound and lighting engineer, as well as now an online real-time sound engineer. I thought I would introduce a few of the key topics just to give a bit of context here and summarize the outcomes of the talk as well, just so you can easily find the information that you're looking for. I'd strongly encourage you to listen to the whole thing because Doug speaks quite clearly and makes a lot of really important points. But hopefully this summary will give you, as I said, some more context for what we talk about and help you to get a bit more out of it. So the first thing is to talk about the different types of connection that we have discussed in the video series so far. Peer-to-peer is the first one. This is the best thing to start with for two people in order to get really low latency. One person sets up a server on their computer and the other person connects directly to that server. We talked about having that with three people instead, and that would give you this triangle shape, each person needing twice as many connections as they had before, and therefore the setup complexity is a bit increased and the use of internet bandwidth is a bit increased as well. Or in the case of 4, you can see that it quickly becomes quite complicated. So this would tend to become unfeasible, I would say, at this point and beyond. A, because the technical setup is a bit complicated for everybody involved to handle. And also because each person now needs 3 times as many connections as they had in the 2-person case. So each person's internet needs to be able to deal with that amount of data. That can be mitigated a bit in Jamulus because of audio compression, which is used there, but that induces latency of its own. And of course, you might not want to have compressed audio, I suppose, as well. And there's a compression option, I think, in Jacktrip as well, but it might be coming down the pipeline soon. I'll put some information about that in the written notes, I hope. So that's peer-to-peer. Good for 2 people, gets worse quickly for more people, but it's definitely the optimal situation for 2 people. I would emphasize that. The next one that we've spoken about is to have a hub server, where one of the participants is the server. So that means they set up a server on their own computer, and it looks like this. So now only one person has to be able to handle that many connections, whereas each other person only has to handle one incoming and outgoing connection. So now just one person has to have good bandwidth. The setup is vastly simpler with Jacktrip or Jamulus when you use this hub server mode. It's much easier to get that sorted. But the bandwidth thing still applies to this one person. It should be the person with the best internet, but even then, maybe it's not quite good enough. Again, you can use compressed audio with Jamulus, or shortly, I believe, with Jacktrip as well, and that will tend to reduce the bandwidth usage and let you get more people. However, something important that Doug speaks about in the discussion is the fact that the person who is running the server on their own computer will tend to be on a back road of the internet, as Doug calls it. So that means that the person's data from this computer, say, to get to this person, has to go off the back roads onto the internet highway, so to speak, and then into another back road, back onto the highway, and then back into the back road again. And that's the important point that Doug makes, actually. It's this idea of having the server positioned in a kind of backwater of the internet where data slows down a bit. That adds latency of its own in this kind of configuration. So people might want to use an external public server. This is particularly the case with Jamulus. Public servers, so external servers which are sort of on an industrial scale, as opposed to being a server on somebody's home computer, they would tend to be not so much on a back road of the internet, but closer to one of the internet highways. So the connection to the server may introduce a bit less latency. However, with a public server, you often don't really know where they are. They might be in a poor geographical location for you. which would add latency again. Also, they could be too busy, so they might be a bit overloaded with people. And by the same token, that they're not private. So if you want to do this with Jamulus, but have a kind of semi-private jam, you need to mute everybody else on the server, which is not really ideal. Obviously, you wouldn't be talking about secret stuff while you were doing this, but all the same, you might want some privacy for your session. And as I said, the publicness of it comes along with this, comes along with a disadvantage in terms of latency usually as well. So the final option that Doug will talk about is an external private server. In this case, you can choose where the server is. So you essentially rent a private server very cheaply that is near the backbone or the highways of the internet, which is good from the latency point of view. And you can choose it to be in the north of England if all of you are based in the north of England, for example. Or you can choose it to be in London if you're all based in London. Then you self-install Jamulus on the server, for example. And that's quite an easy process if you have a little bit of technical facility that maybe you've picked up just in the course of watching these tutorials. It's not that difficult. So that gives you a really good chance of having great latency, having a server with the capacity to handle a large number of people, having privacy, having configurability, so you can set the options on the server and so on. And the prices to rent such a server would be, starting at £4 a month. So that's a really good option if you want to have a lot of people with good performance. So the next and final picture I want to show in the summary here is just a kind of spectrum of things you can try for different numbers of people. I've made two categories here, hobbyist and more serious. I wasn't really sure what to call them, and by all means, you might consider yourself to be in both of these categories, and that's completely fine. It's just a helpful way to organize the ideas. So starting from 2 people, as we said, peer-to-peer is going to be the best chance of having a low latency, either with Jacktrip, to have uncompressed audio and a lot of configuration options and wiring options in terms of sending the audio on to recording or live streaming programs. Or you can do it with Jamulus, of course, or you can use a Jamulus public server, as we've spoken about earlier on in the tutorials. That's not going to be the optimal performance for this case, especially. Moving up to 3 or 4 people, you can set up a hub server at home, either with Jacktrip or Jamulus. Again, you would have the person with the best internet do that, especially with Jacktrip, if you're using uncompressed audio, because that increases the bandwidth that the server needs to be able to provide. So the person with the best internet connection should be doing that. Again, you can use a Jamulus public server, but for the same reasons as here, it's not the optimal thing to do. Finally, when you get up to 8 people or more, I guess you still could try this hub server thing, but as Doug discusses, there's every chance that your hub server, because it's based in a private property, will be not very close to a highway of the internet, and you'll have these latency issues that we discussed. So you might want to think about a Jamulus public server if you don't want to get any more invested or detailed. But again, because it's a public server, you don't have privacy. The location is probably not going to be optimal, and you might have very poor performance, especially with that many people. You might not even be able to get all of you on the server at the same time if it's busy. So moving down to this end, and again, feel free to drift between these categories yourself as you get more interested in this kind of thing. 2 people, I would say peer-to-peer with Jacktrip is the way to go, because I think it's assumed that in this kind of use case, you might benefit from the greater configurability, the higher quality audio, and the option to record in a sort of powerful kind of recording workflow, as I discussed. Same applies to live streaming. Moving up to 3 or 4 people, you might want to try peer-to-peer, especially with 3 people. The triangle is not massively hard to set up, I don't think. and that is going to give you one of the best performances that you can get for 3 people. For 4 people, as we saw on the previous slide, it starts to get a bit complicated from that point onwards. Again, you could try a hub server at home. Again, for the reasons up here, that might give you a bit of a latency penalty. Here, you might want to look into an external private server. That would be quite interesting if you're a bit more serious about this, and Doug will discuss that a bit more in the discussion that's coming up. But as we just mentioned, you can have a private server in an optimal geographical location. It's quite cheap, and if you take a bit of time to install Jamulus on that server yourself, which is quite easy, then you can get a good experience in that way. Jacktrip can also be installed on a private server, but it's a little bit harder to do. You can certainly look for some resources in that direction, and you will find them. Finally, at this end, probably a peer-to-peer setup is going to be too complicated to administer by the time you get to this point. So you're going to end up with not a triangle, not a square, but a vast sort of web of interconnections, which is too much. So you would want to use an external private server. That would give you, as I said, the ability to handle a lot of connections. It could be chosen to be in a good location for everybody mutually to use. And again, you would self-install Jamulus or Jacktrip. So this end of the spectrum in the vertical direction, so to speak, it's if you need a bit of privacy, you have a kind of more professional or semi-professional use case, or just if you want to have the best latency and the best balance of latency and glitches, there's every reason to look into this side of things. So, take a look, see what you fancy, and try more than one of these things, I would suggest. Finally, you can look into paid or managed solutions, either by Doug Hunt, as he talks about in the interview. He's a specialist, especially in performances, so live online performances. So that's how he made his name in this particular field. You can also look into the Jacktrip Foundation or Virtual Studio. They kind of create private Jacktrip servers all around the world on demand. So that's something you can look into, but again, it's a paid for service. So that's the long and short of what we covered in the discussion, I think, and it's a quick kind of crib sheet for either following along with the discussion or, if you really want to, just ignoring it altogether. But I think the best thing to do would be to read over these 2 pages and then follow through what Doug says, because he's really one of the world experts on this. So I'll see you in a moment. This is a chat with Doug Hunt, and it's a general discussion about adding more people to your real-time online music experience. So Doug Hunt is a friend who I know as the managing director of his own sound and light company. But he sort of, we came to know each other because he was behind a very famous live stream of a London-based band earlier on in the lockdown. So this is Mama's Gun. You might have seen this. I mentioned it in the article for ISM that I wrote. I'll just play you a very short snippet of this. I forgot how good that was. I don't want to stop it. Okay, so Doug, I've half introduced you there, and this was one of the highlights of 2020 for me. Really, this kind of thing, the quality that you can hear and the synchrony of music that relies quite a lot on being able to hear each other in real time is really evident there, and it was quite a big deal. You had a lot of emails to deal with after this, I think, from people getting in touch. Is that right?
Yeah, 1 or 2. I mean, it started off as just something I wanted to do. I'm a touring sound engineer and suddenly wasn't able to tour. So, was just looking for a way to continue to make music with the artists that I love, right? So that it started off there.
I guess that's is it 4 or 5 people in that band? I forget. It's 5 people, right?
There's 5 in that band, yeah.
5 people, yeah. So in the tutorials that I've been doing, we've spoken about 2 people. We've added a 3rd person, but I've clearly advised people to begin with just 1-to-1 and sort of see where they can get with that. We've introduced ideas like the idea that 3 people can either be connected in a triangle. People who are watching can go back to the first couple of videos for that. So you can connect in a triangle where everybody suddenly needs twice as many connections as they did before, and if you have 4, then you need 3 times as many, and so on. Or the fact that you can connect in a hub way, so you can have a kind of series of outgoing stalks from the central hub server. But obviously, this is up to 5, and then let's maybe play this video. This is not one that Doug's involved with. This is a good example of, when you said it's hard, you weren't joking. So these guys are using Jamulus, which we've also mentioned in the tutorial quite briefly. It sounds great, but they certainly have to tailor the repertoire to the situation. And I just want to play this snippet here, just so you can get a sense of how much even quite a small delay affects what happens.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Good. Can we do it again? Can you be aware of the delay and try and work against it? It's this trade-off about kind of working. You're trying to stay in time, but the main thing is listening to everybody as well and trying to kind of bring it all together. It's like alchemy, really.
Yeah, so he's he speaks the truth there, and he's clearly he's doing God's work trying to get it all together. The singers sound great, of course, but do you want to talk about what's going on here? You can see how many people there are. What kind of issues are they facing?
I mean, I've been in that guy's position many times, where you're talking to people that potentially don't fully understand what's going on as far as on the nuts and bolts level, and broadly don't care, right? Often as the kind of technician on one of these kind of sessions, you're talking to people that just want it to work for him, but it looks like they're doing a great job, right? And as you say, 16 is a lot. 16 is a lot in any situation, in the real world, or just getting 16 people hooked up with a set of headphones and a microphone in the same room and getting them all to hear what they want to hear. That's the job of a monitor engineer, right? You'd normally have someone whose job it was to do that. So it is a challenge, and in my experience anyway, that's been the biggest challenge. Hasn't been the technology, it's been the kind of social element of getting people to understand what to expect before they start. And therefore have the right level of patience, because these things do take a bit of time to get working smoothly. It is possible once, for me, it's all about safeguarding. It's about choosing tasks and choosing productions that are at least remotely possible. Like since I'm embarked on this, I've been overwhelmed with people that want to do transatlantic collaborations. That seems to be what everyone wants to do, and I just say no. I just say I'm not going to get involved, because it's not possible. I mean, let's do a quick bit of maths. Like I posted on the side of my from London to New York, right? Because that's about as short as you can get. So we're going to call that 3,500 miles.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm going to do 3,500 miles in light seconds.
Right.
Yeah. So that is 18 millilight seconds for light to get from London to New York. Yeah, with nothing in the way. But that's also just one way, right?
Yeah,
one
sure.
Round trip is twice that. So you're almost at 40 milliseconds, which I consider the cutoff. I consider 40 milliseconds as above that. It's not a thing. No one's going to enjoy themselves above that. And then below that, there's a grey area below about 30. everyone's generally okay.
Yeah.
So that's where I work, and that's why, so that's a really important thing, I think, is choosing projects that are possible.
Yeah,
so with the choir, for example, if everybody's in London, great, that's a project that can totally work. If everyone's in the UK, yeah, probably great. But if those individuals are spread out all over the place, maybe just don't embark on that, because people get very fatigued very quickly when things don't work, and people's patience gets sapped, and that takes their creativity away.
So let's backtrack a little bit, because so you did that Mama's Gun project, and you'd worked with them before, so they were kind of almost like guinea pigs, I suppose, for your kind of setup. And how does it work with you being how do you receive this type of project, I suppose? Because I should say you're not just helping people to rehearse or have a kind of evening with a choir in lockdown casually or something like that. You get brought in for sort of stuff that needs to sound good, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, the kind of performance element was what made it interesting. I mean, allowing people to rehearse together was a wonderful side effect of what I wanted to achieve, which was, how can we do a gig that sounds as good as I want it to in this limitation, right? And obviously the biggest challenge in that is the monitoring, right? Is the core problem, the reason that you're talking to me right now, and the reason that everybody's interested. That core problem is the latency, right? And as I'm sure everybody that's listening to this knows, there is some amount of latency that is absolutely impossible to remove, and that's why I brought up the speed of light, right? Because no matter if you're in the same room, I like a good rule of thumb is that in air, sound travels about a foot every millisecond, roughly.
Right.
Like something easily memorable, right? So if you're standing, 10 feet away from someone, you've already got a 20 millisecond round trip on that conversation, right? So there's no such thing as zero latency, and I'd seem to find myself explaining that to a lot of people. There are situations where if you've got really good internet connections, we've managed to get latencies down as low as 15 milliseconds round trip using like commercial grade fiber connections, and that puts people closer than if they were on a big stage.
So let's get a bit more into the details, because I think you'd be a great person to kind of expand on how we extend some of the principles that we've learned already. So two people, I've taught people about setting up a server of their own, acting as the server, doing the port forwarding and stuff to minimize the latency on the first try with two people. We've talked about adding a third person and how somebody can act as a hub server. What would you... I guess if people are assuming people aren't in the kind of commercial position where they can phone up your company and say, come and do this project for us, which of course people are welcome to do who are watching this video. Doug's knows what he's doing in that respect. But for people who aren't in that position, where should they start if they're trying to get, for example, a choir to be able to sing together? Should they try to start with a smaller set of the choir and just try and build a group of people gradually and add more? Should they try to look for an external service? So Jack Tripp, as you know, is starting to roll out these kind of worldwide paid for external servers, which are private and quite fast. Or should somebody try to run a server for 10 people on their home computer? These kind of questions. Where do you start with that? It's tough, I know.
Yeah, it is a really tough one, and it for me it very much depends on what your priorities are. When you start talking about adding more and more people to the session, bandwidth can become a problem quite quickly. What I'm referring to is what you call the triangle model, right? Where everybody connects to everybody. Then everybody has to have enough bandwidth to support, the number of people minus one times whatever the bit rate is for the stream. That's a very complicated way of saying, it scales exponentially, right, with the amount of data that you need. As you correctly said, there's another way of doing this where one person acts as like the hub to the session, and everybody connects to them, which gets around the problem for the people that aren't acting as the hub, but still means that whoever it is that that hub position still has to be able to support enough bandwidth to supply all of the other people. And actually what you've just described there is the way that we first started trying to do this. It quite quickly became evident to me that the performance was not good enough. And the reason for that is that the amount of latency you get between the hub and any one of the others is fine and is acceptable. However, the latency between one of the people that isn't the hub, their latency has to go through the hub to get to one of the others, right? So that effectively doubles the amount of delay that those people are experiencing when they're communicating through them. I just found that to be generally too high. I mean, obviously, if you're in a fantastic situation and you've got a great internet connection, it can work. But as a kind of default place to start, we quite quickly moved away from that model.
So what did you move to?
So basically, it's the same idea, but rather than having the hub being one of the participants, we have the hub sitting on a server, like an actual server. And I appreciate that that's kind of out of the reach of most people. But there's ways around that, and I'm going to get into that in a bit.
Sure. Yeah.
So basically, the piece of logic we put together, but what we realized is that although the internet is often spoken about as a web, it's much more like a road system where you have highways and you have back roads, right? And the data can travel along the highway very fast. It's only that highway is like the backbone, right? The infrastructure, the nationwide internet infrastructure. And then you can think of the back roads as, okay, it's got to get off the backbone of the internet, it's got to go to your internet service provider, and then it's got to go to your exchange. Perhaps if you're on like Virgin, it goes to a cabinet in the street. They're all the back roads, right? And we found that the majority of the time that the data took to get from me to you is actually on those back roads, right? So if we add a server that essentially is connected to the highway, then it doesn't really add that much. The analogy I like to do is if I'm going to drive from my house to your house, John, I could stop at a service station on the way, right? Because it's on the highway and it doesn't add that much time. But if I needed to stop by my friend Fred's house on the way, that's going to add loads more time because I've got to do back roads again. Does that analogy make sense?
It does, yes. And it very nicely explains why an external server can be such a good thing, because the one thing I can't change about where I am, I can pay for the best internet I want, I can have the best computer I want, I can use an Ethernet cable, but I can't change the fact that I'm on a back road of the internet, relatively speaking, whereas a server which is attached to the highway is going to be pretty good for everybody, ideally. That's the idea, right?
Absolutely. And of all the kind of systems that you've mentioned, the one that I think does that the best is Jamulus. Right. I do like it. Now, I would suggest that the issue that the choir that you showed me were having was probably that they are either using a public server, which might be overloaded and probably isn't in the most ideal location for them. You have no real idea where the public servers are, right? They might be, I could run one here on my back road internet connection if I wanted, right? And that's obviously not ideal. The ideal situation is that the server is as central as possible in this kind of highway model of the internet, so that the average distance as far as the internet's concerned, is as low as possible, right? And these things are very easy and cheap to set up. I've been suggesting people sign up for virtual private servers with a company like OVH. You can even use Amazon Web Services and get a free one. But the Amazon ones tend not to be as performant as OVH. I mean, we have recently been having some problems with OVH and Virgin Media connections. There's some weird inconsistency there. But, with a small amount of knowledge, and a bit of research, somebody that's reasonably technical could set a Jamulus server up on an OVH server for about £4 a month in half an hour.
Wow, it's incredible to think, isn't it? So let's talk about the public-private server distinction, just to remind people, because it was a while ago in the tutorials. So you can have a public server and everyone can connect to that, and if it happens to be on a backbone of the internet and it's performs very well for everybody, that might work well. It's still the case that somebody else can join and there's no way you can stop them, right? You might just have to mute them, sort of thing.
Yeah. I assume you mean specifically for Jamulus, right?
I guess, yeah, and I guess for Jamulus with the public server, that's what I mean. Because for example, I was demoing Jamulus earlier on with the public server, and nobody was on the server. I was just talking away, and then just as I was about to leave, someone from Italy showed up on the server, presumably because I was there, and so. If you don't go the private server route, there's no way that you can really stop that, right? I mean, it's not really the spirit that's running for public servers. Is that?
No, the developers of Jamulus are quite. I want to say focused on their vision for what Jamulus is, and again, it's the reason that I couldn't end up using it was because it doesn't align with my requirements as an audio professional. But that being said, it does do what it does very well. And when you set up a Jamulus server, which is actually ludicrously easy once you know how, you can choose to not list it in the public listing.
I see.
So then it's hidden, right?
Right.
And when you connect to it in Jamulus,
this bit here,
exactly there, server it is. Right. So you were running a server on your own machine at one point.
I was, that's right.
But so rather than listing your server in that list above, IP address of private server, and if you know what you're doing, you can obviously register that IP address with a DNS, with a domain, so that you could get whatever, Jamulus.john. whatever, But that's not necessary. Now, there's no security there, so if someone guesses that IP address, then, they're in. But I would suggest for the purposes of rehearsing music, it's sufficient. Right?
Yeah, it's not like you're discussing state secrets or talking about your PIN numbers on the call.
One would hope not.
One would hope not. Yeah. Okay. So just to go through that process, because I'll probably make some notes about this in the written notes, or maybe a slide that I'll insert into the video afterwards. But the procedure for that would be, if people want to have a private, quite multiple people, so beyond kind of low to middle single figures, the easiest route for someone who doesn't want to go down the full kind of professional setup thing, and doesn't want to enlist a company like you, they would rent essentially a private server like from OVH, and then the procedure for actually installing Jamulus on that server is relatively simple as well. Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, these servers don't run Windows, right?
Okay,
and they don't run Mac OS.
Right.
They tend to run Linux.
Got you.
So if you don't know the first.
Okay. Yeah, I see. I got. Okay. So it's maybe it's at the level that people might have had to get through on parts of my tutorial, really, because we did use the terminal and that sort of thing. But it's basically a matter of logging into that remote server, installing the Jamulus server software on there, and knowing the IP address of that server, and then
exactly. If
you're
you
good
can
to
use the terminal,
Yeah.
you know, in Mac OS, then you're more than 50% of the way there.
Got you.
And, you know, the instructions on the Jamulus website, at least the last time I checked, were very easy to follow.
Great,
so I wouldn't be, you know, for the sake of £4, which, you know, is the minimum, you only have to sign up for a month. It's worth trying.
Well worth a try. Yeah, it really is. Yeah, we might have to get you back to do a short video tutorial on that at some point, because I think you know, we might want to sort of extend the instructions to account for that explicitly. That would be really interesting. So you said that for your kind of professional purposes, and presumably we have some audience which is like that. You don't use Jamulus yourself. I empathise with that a bit for me, because I use Jacktrip on a 2 or 3 person basis, partly for a kind of recording workflow, you know, where you can wire up the jack connections to Logic. I do it with, because I have an old enough OS that I can use that plugin, you know, or Arda, the workstation, the digital audio workstation that runs under Jack. So I empathise with the desiring the greater configurability of Jacktrip and so on. So can you talk about the sort of threshold beyond which you step in, and the kind of specialized purposes that people might want to use your skills for? You know?
Yeah, of course. If you're really confident with whatever you're using for 2, and you've got your head around it, you know, go for your life. I'd say that you can still do good work, you know, peer to peer with 3 people.
So that would be the triangle connection, just to reinforce that.
Yeah. Sorry, peer to peer, directly from one person to another. Any more than that, I would recommend to a customer, for instance, not to pursue that, because it becomes too frustrating too quickly. Not only for the people that are on the session as performers, but for the technicians that might be trying to set it up in the background. It becomes very time consuming, and require, you know, simple things, or things that seem very simple, like forwarding a port on a router, can be quite intimidating to some people when they don't understand it. And with 4 people or more, you're in a better place going with something like Jamulus. And I guess what your original question actually was at what point do I step in?
Sure. Yeah. Exactly. So there's more than one threshold, so to speak, isn't there? There's this kind of, you know, there's a level at which you get. I guess there's a transition to having enough people that you need to make it easy. And that happens to be the point at which bandwidth might be an issue anyway. So at that point, you might want to switch to Jamulus on a public server just to try it out. You know, recognizing that there's don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, you know, and just get people working. And then there's another threshold at which point people might want to employ people, you know, like you, to set things up. So what are the reasons that people do that rather than carrying on themselves, you know?
Yeah, of course. I mean, okay, so just to briefly talk a little bit about the difference, you know, I mean, we've spoken quite a lot about Jacktrip and Jamulus, and obviously there are other platforms that do the same thing, but they broadly fall into those 2 kind of categories, right? Jamulus has an algorithm in it that constantly tries to reduce the buffer lengths. You know, obviously, if you've used Jacktrip, you'll be familiar with the -Q.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
which is the length of your buffer, and you've probably realised that some days you need a longer buffer than others, right?
That's right.
And what Jamulus does is it automatically, and I'm sure most people know this, but it automatically tries to reduce that. Now, the outcome of that is that you have the lowest possible latency, you know, in theory at least, you know, the lowest possible latency you could have for a given network situation. You know, how congested the internet is, how much is going on, where everybody's located, all that stuff. The disadvantage with this is that the audio going over the network is then distorted. It breaks up.
Yeah.
And that happens with Jacktrip as well. But, you know, with Jacktrip, you can, you know, and with Jamulus as well, you can manually set a buffer length to get the desired quality, you know, at the best latency you can.
Yeah, that's so people will be familiar with from the first slide that I showed. Basically, was a spectrum of latency versus glitches, and the fact that being aware of that is going to make you a lot less stressed than you would be otherwise. So yeah, we've exactly spoken about how for some music you might just want to tolerate the glitches in order to have the really tight rhythmic coordination, and then if it's a recording job, at least you can still record without glitches, even if anything.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of universal, and I would suggest that if you are doing a project that neither of those things is acceptable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like for instance with the Mama's Gun video you showed earlier, we needed very low latency and we needed perfect broadcast audio. If those are your requirements, that's when it's best to get someone like me involved.
Right. Yeah.
Because we've built our own platform. It's called Tin Pan Studio.
Fantastic. Yeah.
It works broadly in the same way as a lot of these other things, but tailored to the needs of professional audio types rather than, I don't want to say hobbyists, but people that just want it to work, right?
Sure.
So our platform allows us on our side behind the scenes a huge amount of control over the way it works. But as far as the user's concerned, it's completely transparent. Zero config. Everything's super easy.
Yeah. Wow. I think that will make sense to people really, because I think we've seen by comparing Jamulus and Jack Trip already how although the software is very much the same in principle, there's so many different things that can be emphasized, aren't there? Like in Jamulus, the idea of onward connectivity into recording software or streaming software is less emphasized than it is in Jack and Jack Trip, for example. And so I guess you're saying that if you have that kind of situation where people want to pay to produce most often a performance, I don't suppose you spend that much time coordinating rehearsals between people, do you? Or
I mean, we have done because in order to feel comfortable with the platform, any platform, then you need to use it, right?
Yeah, sure.
So we normally, we'll normally set people up with the platform and then let them rip with it for a couple of weeks. Let them rehearse, let them get comfortable, let them learn what bits of their show work best, in that scenario. So that when we actually come to broadcast, they're already happy with the way it works.
I see. Yeah, exactly. So okay, yeah. So it makes a lot of sense. So the thing that happens when you bring somebody in, especially a professional who's focused on professional sound and in the real world, so to speak, is that you get to this idea of the performers not having to do anything in terms of configuration. The monitoring is being sorted. The trade-off of latency and glitches is being sort of bypassed, so to speak, because you're almost using distinct, what would you call it, distinct channels sort of thing for the
exactly. So we can configure individual streams for individual purposes, right?
I see.
So the monitor mixes will be super fast. We've got an algorithm that conceals the jitter error.
Oh wow, yeah.
Kind of synthesizes audio over dropouts.
Yeah.
But then the engineer's audio that comes to whoever's mixing it, and we can mix it in software or we can mix it at our studio in hardware. That could be slower, right? That can afford to be a tenth of a second, maybe even a half a second is fine. For the broadcast audio. So we can configure those channels, and that's the thing that makes what we do work for us. And I'd say it's the same as for me. It comes down to the same conversation as like doing any other kind of show. It's like go for your life. You can hire a PA and plug it in yourself, or buy a PA, plug it in yourself, have a great time, have a great show. Obviously wonderful, If you want, though, you can hire a company to come and set up a PA and make it sound the way that they make it sound, and have all their extra tweaks and expertise, and that's the difference. It's obviously not for everybody. But,
sure.
Because I mean, all that kind of info is useful to people like you and I. But I keep thinking that the people that are watching this, they probably just want to know how to do it, right?
Yeah. So we could do a quick stab, on a kind of just as you said, a kind of ground up thing. Maybe that picture of, at what point does adding things to the jack trip thing, or at what point does it become less feasible to keep doing that? And then
we did that though, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. Maybe if I put a diagram, along those lines and sort of jump in and do it myself, I think that will be clear.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, actually, to be honest, I think one of the most key things I said was probably the bit about choosing your battles.
Yeah.
Choosing projects that are possible, using any server, client server model like Jamulus or my thing or whatever. Choosing the location of the server is actually super important, right?
Yeah.
People don't often think about where in the world the servers are. When you're checking your emails or something.
Sure.
That doesn't matter. But when you're signing up for a VPS, they call them virtual private server, on OVH or Amazon. Just get one. They'll ask you where you want your server to be, and make sure it's as close as possible. And if you're all in the north of England, then the north of England is better than London, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds good. Okay, so thanks very much, Doug Hunt, for talking to us about that. That's really enlightening, and people will know where to find you if they want to enlist your services. If they're not in that kind of position, then you're giving us some great ideas for how to deal with having more people on your online real-time connection. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, John.
Cheers.